Good morning, family. Welcome to the African Esquire Show on WCC TV. I am Tierney Cherie, the host of this segment. Let me know if you hear me okay in the chat. Welcome today. We're going to have an interesting conversation about some things that I've been noticing in the news. We know that still the Ukraine and Russia crisis is going on, and because of that, constantly we're going to see the West trying to make that the most important thing, even inside of the minds of Africans, even on the African continent, despite the fact that we have our own issues, despite the fact that that war, honestly, is far away from us, even though our economies are unfortunately intertwined with the European continent. But it's something that should not be in our peripheral if you think about what Africa needs. Africa needs development. Africa needs to unite. Africa needs to move forward, not necessarily be boggled down into these conflicts. And yet we constantly see that if something's on the mind of the West, if something is bothering the West, that these things are supposed to be bothering us. These things are supposed to affect us. At least that's how things are painted. So we're going to talk about that today. And I'm going to first just remind you all, again, this is We Charge Colonialism TV, and We Charge Colonialism. We're an organization. I like to remind you all because I think because of YouTube, sometimes we just think that it's a YouTube page, just people doing videos, but we have an agenda. We have things that we're trying to promote. So you can go to our YouTube page. You can subscribe to our newsletter to get updates anytime that we have articles, and our monthly videos will also be on there. And in addition, I do want to remind you all something very important. If you have not already registered for the convention that is July 21st to 22nd, and that is after Africa Unity Movement for Decolonization. This is a convention that's going to be jointly held by a number of African-led organizations, and it's very important that we have people who care about the decolonization of not just Africa, but of Africans around the world. So even if you're not in Africa, if you're in America, you understand that we're also being colonized. And so we have to have a conversation across borders. And that's really what this is going to be. So I would just like to encourage you all, please do register for this convention. We have a lot of good speakers. I'm going to click the link to register just so you can see. But basically, you go to this page. If you click the link, it will take you to this page, and you can see some of the speakers that will be at the convention, some who I'm sure you know very well, others maybe you don't know so well, but I promise you a lot of these people have dynamic stories and things to tell you about their experiences. And so, again, please register, be a part of this conversation. Even if you're not sure if you can join on the day of, I encourage you just to register. And hey, give the invite to someone else that you think needs to hear this important message or needs to engage inside of this topic, because at the end of the day, we're only going to do this together. We're not going to do this apart. So good morning, everyone. Yes, I hear. Okay, great that you hear me. And yeah, I see my brother Ikemba. Please do register for the convention, most important event of the year. Yes, I think it'll be very important, especially because of the idea that we understand Africans, we're talking about so many things. I mean, right now, so much, if you go to African news websites, everything's about like Russia, Ukraine. And it's like, we have a huge problem as African people. We as African people are constantly being colonized. Like, that's something that I think we have to understand, that neo-colonialism is just as volatile and might even be more volatile than formal colonialism. When you have it inside of an internal colony like the United States, yes, that's very volatile. We're dealing with something that's far worse than what we talk about. And so we have to make our issues the number one on the agenda. So hopefully everyone will register for that. I also just want to let you all know an FYI. I think I'm going to change the format again. If you all remember, I used to pre-record videos, and then I switched to doing live streams to try it out, which has been easier as far as editing. But I'm going to try to do some more pre-recording and see how that works for my schedule. Still, we'll have lives though. We'll have Frank doing his live on Friday, and obviously on Saturday morning we have the WCC podcast and book club, so that will still be live. So just giving you all a heads up that you'll see a change as far as the formatting of this particular show. All right, so let's get into it. I want to talk about a lot of people are complaining inside of the West. A lot of people inside of the international sphere a lot of the state actors, they're complaining about Africans. They're saying, hey, Ukraine should be on your mind like it is on our mind. Now, I know there's been some Africans who have jumped ship and just basically said, oh, we're going to throw the Ukrainians flowers. We're going to go and, basically say, hey, come here to Africa. We'll take care of you. In fact, whenever we have our break, where we talk about African news, we're going to talk about a certain HBCU in the United States that has done something similar. So, yeah, we're getting this from certain people, certain individuals, but overwhelmingly on the African continent, the Ukraine-Russia issue has not gotten a lot of public stances coming from the leaders on the African continent. And the West has been complaining. As you all know, they're all in one accord. They're saying, hey, we're all supporting Ukraine. You should all support Ukraine. Never mind the history of Ukraine. Never mind whether or not Ukrainians would support you. Never mind whether we would support you. Everyone should be on the same page with us as supporting Ukraine against Russia, right? That's what the West has been pushing. Now, Africa has been pretty silent on this, has been reluctant to comment overwhelmingly, although you have a few people like Nana Akufo-Addo and also that one Kenyan ambassador who did do a talk on comparing Ukrainians' war to colonialism, which was nonsense. But yeah, so let's read through this article really quickly. So I saw this on the Griot. It says, Africa mostly quiet amid widespread condemnation of Russia. Now, Uganda's president, Yoweri Museveni, all these ads messing me up. Museveni recently remarked that Russia's war on Ukraine should be seen in context of Moscow being the center of gravity for Eastern Europe. His son, Muhuzi Karerugaba, I shouldn't even try that one. I'm sorry, everyone. He was forceful in his declaration that most Africans should support Russia's stand in Ukraine. And he said, Putin is absolutely, a lot of people saying this, they're being caught traitors. But if you think more objectively about what's being said, and you all know, I'm really big on, let's be very clear. This is not our fight. I understand NATO has definitely done things in the African continent. But I want to emphasize that this is something that is going on beyond Africa, and we have things that should be our fight. This is not our fight. But a lot of people objectively, if you think about how the West moves, thinks that Russia's essentially doing what most countries would do inside of their same circumstance. So for example, let's say the Bay of Pigs invasion. If you don't know, Cuba, a sovereign country. And basically Russia had been sending weapons to Cuba. So what does the United States do? They invade a sovereign country. And it's kind of the same thing if you think about it, like Ukraine, sovereign country. The United States has been putting weapons in there. The United States have been trying to bring them into NATO, which means that any country that joins NATO is basically like a gang. So if they were to join NATO and anyone were to attack Ukraine, everyone in NATO would have to jump in. So that would be pretty big, right? And before they do this, Russia basically intervenes and causes a war, basically trying to force Ukraine to take a neutral stance. Now, that's literally what we know that the United States would do and has done. We also know that the West in general is the biggest interveners inside of sovereign countries. I mean, that's why when everyone was complaining about Russia intermingling or something like that with the United States, meddling with the United States elections, everyone was like, common sense, everyone. Like, who's the biggest entity that infiltrates elections? It not even just put some fake Facebook groups online, like literally will cause the coup, will put the funding in place, will provide the weapons, the one who will literally fund the candidate that they want to win, who will conveniently try to demonize the alternative one. That's the United States. So it's just very hypocritical whenever you look at how we're supposed to look the other way. And obviously the biggest imperialist on this globe is the United States government, is the United States military. So anything that they have to say about another country, It's always going to be looked at as hypocrisy if you're looking objectively. However, the world is not looking objectively right now. The world is trying to paint a rosy picture, just like they're trying to ignore the Africans that are suffering in Ukraine, just like they're trying to ignore the fact that a lot of Nazism is being celebrated in Ukraine. Completely want to go with one narrative that's going to support their telling of events, because that's how the world moves. So it says, amid a worldwide chorus of condemnation, and that's really what it is, like a chorus of condemnation coming from all the countries of the world. Much of Africa has either pushed back or remained noticeably quiet. 25 of Africa's 54 nations abstained or didn't record a vote in the UN General Assembly resolution earlier this month. And by the way, a lot of countries that are abstaining or voting no are basically behind the scenes are kind of being like ostracized by other countries, because that's really how they move. They want this world to move one way. And that's what I've said in the previous videos, that if you really look at what's happening, this is about a fight for the world order that the United States wants to exist, where it's basically United States and Europe, and everyone has to go with them, versus a new world order that they're trying to implement that's multipolar, where you have Russia and China, and you have other countries that are going to basically be the ones who are equally as powerful and equally basically going to be the ones determining what's going on. They want to keep things basically the same as normal. The same as normal is that the whole world has to go with the West. They call it the liberal world order. I did a video on that previously too. Now, the reason many nations on the continent, 1.3 billion people, have long-standing ties and support from Moscow dating back to the Cold War, when the Soviet Union supported anti-colonial struggles. We know this, right? Those relations have tightened in recent years. A U.S. interest in Africa appeared to wane under President Donald Trump's administration. Russia, along with China, expanded its influence, enlarging its economic footprint to include everything from agricultural programs to energy plants. In 2019, dignitaries from 43 African nations attended, oh my gosh, all these freaking ads keep messing me up. I'm sorry. Attended a summit with Russia, which has also become the dominant exporter of weapons into sub-Saharan Africa, according to Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. The developments have not gone unnoticed. Last month, the European Union leaders held a long-delayed summit in Brussels to discuss ways to counteract Russia and China's influence in Africa, while Western military civilian leaders are eyeing Russia's advancing presence on both the African continent and in the Middle East, and as long-term threats to security to the West. China also is among the few countries showing support for Moscow. So what's not really addressed in this article, but what we're going to talk about today, is the fact that obviously we know that Russia has more of a presence in Africa than it has in more recent years. China has a pretty large presence in Africa, and we know obviously that the West has a large presence in Africa. All of these are foreign nations. None of them are there for the betterment of Africa. All of them are there for their own self-interest. That's literally what world politics are about. International relations, it's about self-interest. You're inside of a sovereign country, a region, basically to promote your own self-interest there. And because the United States does not want competition, the US and Europe, they want to basically be the only ones who are inside of Africa. They view this as a threat to their sovereignty. And what we're going to see is that things are being framed in such a way right now that I don't know if you all agree or if you all have noticed, but it seems a lot like the West and the media are kind of baiting World War III, like intentionally, as much as like everyone would like hate, I'm sure, that to happen, because you're talking about gas prices now. Imagine a nuclear war among the most powerful countries. Leaders are intentionally trying to bait countries like China and Russia into basically engaging with the side of a war. I mean, it's like constantly you're hearing the intelligence community saying things like, oh, we know what's going to happen. We know it's going to happen. And it's like, you know it's going to happen because you want it to happen, or you know it's going to happen because you actually have reliable information that this is what's going to happen. And we have to understand, at the same time, while they're baiting Russia and China into an international war, that Africa is going to be in a very difficult position because of the infiltration of multiple foreign actors on the African continent. So again, we know China has a growing presence in Africa, probably the largest presence in Africa of a single nation. We know that Russia has a more growing presence, a more military presence. In fact, in the CAR, there were actually pro-Russia protests basically saying like support Putin inside of this war in Ukraine, because they basically support Russia because that has given them a way to rid themselves of the French presence inside of Africa. But the backdrop to this is going to be possibly Africa being pushed into proxy wars. And that's something that we're hoping is not going to happen. But it's the stage is really being set. And I'm going to show you a number of articles that kind of prove this. Like they're setting a stage for proxy wars in the event of a World War III. And if that happens, then we're going to see, once again, if you don't know the history of World War I, hate saying World War, World War I, World War II, if you know the history of those nations, Africa was always dragged into these conflicts by their colonial oppressors. Literally, that's the history. World War I, Africa gets dragged in. World War II, Africa gets dragged in by the countries that are colonizing them. Now, how interesting is it that when you're talking about neocolonialism, this has the same effect? Basically, that the US is going to point at other countries and say that, hey, your influence inside of this country. So let's say they point at the Central African Republic and say your influence inside of the CAR is going to basically be deemed a threat to United States security. And so you have different regions in Africa also being pointed at as being enemy territories. That's what the stage is being set as. So I'm just going to show you some articles that are going to show you this. And before we get into that, of course, though, I do want to talk about some African news, some interesting African news, some disappointing, but from around the diaspora. So we're just going to take a brief break and talk about a few things that are happening. Okay, I think I told you all I wanted to tell you all some good things and some things not so good. So as far as the good things, I was actually pleased to see this. Anytime that I hear Africans waking up about the British royal family and their colonial presence inside of the African experience, I'm always, happy to hear that. So if you look at what's happening in the Caribbean, so William and Kate, the British royals, are on a tour. And these are the tours that the colonialists do all the time, particularly inside of quote unquote Commonwealth countries, Commonwealth, basically neo-colonial countries, is they go on these tours, they go to some sick villages or some poor villages, they see some sick children and they get these photo ops and they get to look like they care and everything like that. And this is basically like the ambassadors that are sent out to basically put a bow on colonialism and make it look nice and make it look beautiful and make it look like, oh, we're here for all of you. They do this all the time, right? We've all seen it. And interesting enough, this time, William and Kate have faced protests while they're on their Caribbean tour. So we're just going to talk about that briefly. William and Kate are facing protests as they continue their week-long tour of the Caribbean to celebrate Queen Elizabeth's Platinum Jubilee. Basically they were forced to cancel one of their stops in Belize over the weekend when protests broke out ahead of their arrival. The protests, led by indigenous people, some holding signs against colonialism, prompted the couple to visit another local cocoa farm instead of the one they originally planned to tour in the foothills of the Maya Mountains. As William and Kate arrived in Jamaica on Tuesday, another protest is planned in that country. A group known as the Advocates Network, which describes itself as a nonpartisan alliance of individuals and organizations advocating for human rights and good governance, has published an open letter protesting the royals' visit, saying that the British rule has perpetuated the greatest human rights tragedy in the history of humankind. And it's very true. I mean, I don't like trying to figure out which country did it worse, because honestly, they all did it very different. Not all did it very different, but the level of damage done to not just Africans, indigenous people in general, it's really hard to quantify, like, okay, who did it the worst? But I would say definitely there's a good possibility that it was England. Even if you look at the horrific crimes against the Kenyan people and the Land and Freedom Party, also known as the Mau Mau. I mean, just disgusting acts of terrorism. But again, it's hard to quantify, because then you look at what Germany did in Namibia, then you look at, you know, the genocide of indigenous people in America. I mean, it's like constant throughout the colonial experience, death on death, grotesque actions. And so Britain definitely would be one of the top ones, right? We know that the UK, I think actually more than all the other countries, gained the most monetarily from their actions in the colonial system. The what's it called? The East Indian Company, which was the biggest, it's the most richest corporation to date, although it no longer exists. But if you look at the money they made, they've made more money than Apple, whatever Elon Musk does, they made more money than him, all off of the backs of people being colonized inside of Africa and also inside of India. So this is this is really what they get. The fact that you think you can parade yourself throughout the Caribbean, throughout African countries without any type of recourse after the horrible crimes that have been done. I mean, it's like almost like if Hitler won World War I or World War II, and the Nazis felt like they could go on a tour of the world and basically say, "Oh, we're here because we're good to you people," and all that. Well, all because you won the war does not mean that you're in a moral standing. So we know that as far as global influence, that the UK has won. They're on the victor's side. They're still in power. They're still benefiting from the colonial system. They're still benefiting from the business interests inside of those countries. So they're basically left unscratched from their horrific crimes. And so they feel like they can go around to African countries or go around to Caribbean countries, go around to places that a reign of terror literally happened, and they could pretend as if it's a photo op, but that's unacceptable. So I'm really happy more and more that African people are waking up to this ridiculous thing that we've allowed to happen, and more we're calling these people out. And I'll just close by just adding that it was also interesting to me that the Jamaican government would not foot the bill on this tour, which was like, thank you. Not only were they saying like, we're going to have all these protests, but they actually said, we're not going to be paying for your tour. And that might be a small thing to some of you, because it's like, well, why would you pay anyways? But this is something that usually happens. And so we're seeing the conscience of people waking up. We're seeing people understanding that what happened to our people was unacceptable. And that's something that we should always be happy about. Now, let's talk about something I said, there's some good stuff to talk about. Let's talk about some bad stuff that's happening that we should discuss. Hampton University, an HBCU, a historically Black college university. And I just want to, if anyone doesn't know, HBCUs, because I don't know which part of the African experience you're coming from when you're watching this. HBCUs are historically Black colleges and universities in the United States. At one point, African people had to go to these universities. Now many people basically opt for them because one, still there's a discrepancy inside of college admissions. So many Black people still go to these institutions. And two, I think a lot of people, it's a cultural feeling of belonging. I mean, if I were to do it again, I did not go to a HBCU, but if I were to do it again, I would have. And so I think it's something that a lot of people look at as providing some type of alternative universe for African people where we're not being exposed to a white supremacist curriculum. Now, I'm not saying this is what it is, because I know of some HBCUs that are teaching the colonial curriculum. I know of some of them that are reinforcing class stereotypes. So this is not to say that the picture that's painted of them is necessarily accurate, but this is what a lot of people expect, at least. Now, what you would not expect is for your HBCU, and these schools are very expensive. I want people to understand this too. Hampton University, I don't know how much it is, but I remember a friend that was going there, and it's a very expensive school, right? These are private institutions. So the amount of financial aid is not going to be as easy to access if you were to go to like a state school. Although there are some HBCUs that are state schools, I'm pretty sure Hampton is not one of them. So So these schools are pretty expensive. A lot of people have said, you know, we need some type of support for the students. And a lot of people have put money in for that because of this reason, because tuition sometimes at some of these schools is ridiculous, right? And despite the fact that it's expensive for African students, despite the fact that many of them might be suffering just to go to this institution and have that experience, Hampton University offered 50 Ukrainian students free room and board to come and get educated at their institution. So let's read from this article. Amid the ongoing war in Ukraine, the country is receiving swarms of American support. They're receiving support from everywhere. Like, you know, Europe basically is saying, come, pushing other people who are on the waiting list to basically immigrate into European countries, pushing them aside and say, come, Ukrainians. America is doing the same thing. So you're seeing the whole world lay out the world carpet for one singular nation that had a crisis starting a few weeks ago, whereas the world has been in crisis from the actions of these same powers for hundreds of years. So this is what's happening. Amid this ongoing war, so the country is receiving support from America. Last Wednesday, HBCU Hampton University announced its plan to aid the European country by offering free room, board, and tuition to Ukrainian and international students who are studying there. The official statement says that in a humanitarian effort to help those college students and families affected by the current conflict in Ukraine, Hampton University President Dr. William R. Harvey has announced that it will invite 50 to 100, so not 50, 50 to 100 Ukrainian and international college students presently studying in Ukraine to continue their education on HU's campus this summer. After enjoying a summer of free education at one of the top HBCUs in the country, the Ukrainian international students would have the option to stay at HU for regular tuition and fees once the summer semester ends. The collective Hampton University faculty and staff and students are heartbroken because the war-torn country, this is what was said by the president of Ukraine, must deal with the atrocities like the bombing of maternity wards, hospitals, and other civilian areas. And of course, these bombings of maternity wards, hospitals, horrible. Who else has been dealing with this for a long time? Many people inside of the African continent, many people. And the fact that this was completely like ignored and acted like, oh, but we're going to care more about this particular circumstance is unacceptable. And a lot of people, the thing that was happy about were actually outraged about this. So a lot of people, so here's one that says, I attend Hampton University now, and I recently took out a loan for $10,500 loan to pay my remaining balance. I'm beyond livid. What they are doing, another user wrote, I'm in a process, sorry, let me read that again. I'm beyond livid about what they are doing. That's what another user wrote. And they said, I'm in a process of sending an email to the president and seeking legal options. I could use that money and other students like me can. Someone said, so that's the one I just read. They said, bringing Ukrainians to come to HU to complete their studies. Where are the white Ivy League universities or white state land grant colleges making that offer? A very good question. Like, you know, this is a historically black college that's making this offer, and there are white ran institutions that could do this also. People have called it embarrassing. And of course, there's the added layer. And, you know, my husband brought up this point. It's like, it'd be different if they had extended this to the African students who were forced to go to Ukraine because of the colonial situation in Africa to study. And they said, all of you students who are basically being pushed out of Ukraine and who were discriminated against, you know, HU will help you because we understand your situation, that you are akin to us. But no, they actually are offering this to the Ukrainian students too. So this is the crazy contradictions that we live in, unfortunately. And I don't know like what the answer is to this. I mean, I don't know if people are going to protest this at HU. I certainly would not look at that institution as being one that cares for the African people, if that's what their reputation is. When you have students who are suffering, students who are in debt, and yet you're going to roll out the carpet for another student body population and not even keep in mind that the people who are actually on your campus who are already historically disenfranchised, they're suffering. So I just had to share that with you all. I'm sure you're just as upset with this as I am, but this is unfortunately the colonial situation that a lot of our people are dealing with, mental colonialism, which unfortunately will have you doing things against your own interests. So the last story that we're going to deal with, I just think it's important to highlight, and this is going to tie more into what we're talking about today. There's been a lot of Kenyan soldiers who are being killed in Somalia, and they said it's basically being a secret right now. If you don't know, the United States, AFRICOM are really going at Somalia right now, and they're using Kenyan military to do it, but that's something that's not as openly discussed. So this is one article. They said this silence has worsened the frustration of one soldier's family. They said, how many young men are going to lose before our boys are brought back home? How many families should bear the pain of this war fought in distant lands? And that's really the question for most wars. Like, why is it that we're sending our people to basically die in these wars? But of course, the more insidious part about this is that this war is really being led by America. So the U.S. I'm sorry, I'm reading some quotes. So family members are angry about the government's silence when Kenyan troops die in action. They say the blackout and lack of public honoring is disrespectful. The authorities have not explained why they keep quiet about military deaths. And I'll tell you why they're keeping quiet, because they don't want there to be a direct correlation between the presence of AFRICOM in the African continent and the sending of African troops to do the operations on behalf of the U.S. government. Current estimates suggest that hundreds of Kenyan soldiers have died in Somalia, resulting in about 200 deaths. The military said it would launch an inquiry and release details of soldiers who had died in the attacks 6 years ago, but this has not been done. They're asking that the government be open about this, but of course, this is going to be done in secret because it's kind of hiding the U.S. portion of this, the U.S. influence of this war. There was fury online in Kenya last week when the U.S. military honored 3 Kenyan soldiers for their bravery during the Manda base attack in January 2020, while the Kenyan government and armed forces did not offer any commendations. The only official acknowledgement of Kenyans who have been killed in action is the monument, which has been inaugurated by President Uhuru Kenyatta on an annual Kenya Defense Forces Day. A tradition was started after the military went into Somalia. So I just wanted to raise that because this is going to go directly into what we're going to be talking about today. We have an issue where the United States has chosen to basically focus on Somalia as going to be one of the countries that they're going to target. Many of other countries inside of the African continent as far as AFRICOM. And they're not going to use their own forces because remember all that backlash that happened whenever there was, I think there was like 5 troops that were killed. I think it was in Nigeria, and it was American troops. And the media went nuts, like, well, why are you even there? What they'll do instead is they'll train African forces on the ground and they'll send them into these territories. Now, they're sending them basically many times to their deaths. And because, unfortunately, you have someone like Kenyatta who's not trying to disclose the nature of the closeness of the American operation to their own country, they're going to try to basically downplay it. And so this is something serious that we should keep in mind. These AFRICOM operations, I think, honestly, any foreign military operations in the African continent being done and conducted, they're always going to be done in such a way that it's going to screw the balance of power for African people. And it's going to allow for certain people to basically die without getting any type of recognition, die for a cause that has nothing to do many times with us, and die basically to cover up the mass chaos that has been created by these imperialist powers. So that's just something I want us to keep in mind in general. And we're actually going to talk again about how this is going to play directly into this amping up of World War III. So with that, let's go to our next segment. Okay, so we're not going to take too long with this. I just want to break down what's happening as far as this whole World War III saga that's been happening. So again, if you don't know, a lot of people have been saying it's coming. It's going to be World War III. I don't know if it's coming, but I do know that there's preparations that are being made in the event that something does pop off. And when it does, if or when it does pop off, they're not going to be content with this thing staying in Europe. They're not going to be content with this thing staying between NATO and Russia or China. They're not going to be content with that. They have to literally drag the whole world in. That's why, as much as, some people don't like the word World War III because they feel like it wasn't our war, which it wasn't our war. But Africans were dragged into that war because we're powerless, because we're owned and colonized. So that's literally what you can say it was. Not that it was our war, but Africans were dragged in. Africans were targeted many times, African countries. And so, and even Caribbean Africans, many Africans fought inside of those wars. So we do see that it's not going to just affect the West. That's something that I think we should understand. I think some of us in our minds were like, well, if they go to war, it's not going to, come on our doorstep, because we're good, we're leaving them to their devices. They're going to drag us in because China has too much money in the African continent. China has too much money in the African continent. Do you see how the US right now is conducting itself to isolate Russia? And basically any countries that are not falling in line with that isolation, they're also basically being isolated. That's something similar that you can expect whenever it comes to African countries. So right now, again, I started off the video talking about how a lot of Africa is being silent right now. The West is complaining. Why are you silent? Why are you not condemning Russia, right? And if you understand that if it were to escalate to the point of war, all of those assets that China has in Africa, all the ones that Russia is having in Africa, that's going to be targeted. And I think we have to understand that. That's why I'm really, really, I'm not a fan of taking imperialist propaganda about what's happening in Africa with China and Russia and treating that like, oh, this is what the biggest issues are in Africa. The biggest issue that I have, though, is that when we accept these foreign relationships, that exposes us to foreign issues, foreign fights, foreign wars. And that's what could really happen. So I want us to understand there's a lot of consequences to Africa not being sovereign and standing on its own. There's a lot of consequences that can happen if Africa continues this trajectory of allowing foreign investments to basically be the way that Africa is able to do anything. And we know most of those investments only go to the hands of a few billionaires, right? But still, like if you're talking about sanctions, again, imagine if China were to invade Taiwan and the US declares war on China in a doomsday scenario, right? But because China and Russia both have nuclear weapons, so does US and France and a few countries, like a lot more have gained nuclear weapons than what I thought. France, UK, I think there's some I don't know if it's the United Immigrants, but there's the Middle Eastern country that has nuclear weapons. So imagine that's happening, right? And you know who's going to be targeted? They're going to be looking at a list. Okay, how can we hurt China? What can we do to hurt China? Oh, you see all those investments that China has in Africa? Oh, what can we do to hurt Russia? Oh, you see all those investments that Russia has in Africa? Let's just target those. And you see that with proxy wars. You see people bomb. Think about like what happened, for example, with different wars. Whenever you see countries bombing countries that have nothing to do with the conflict, that happens all the time. A country will bomb a country that has nothing to do with the conflict because let's say the country that they actually have beef with happens to have a big industry, a big steel mill or something like that inside of the country. So they'll come and bomb those assets and that whole country will basically be violated because of something that they have nothing to do with. So this is why we should honestly be curious about, what are we going to do as African people if we're dragged into this war? So I want to show you, I'm not just, being a conspiracy theorist. I want to show you what's being talked about in the imperialist press about Africa's links to China and Africa and how basically they're trying to frame this. So this is coming from AFRICOM. Remember, AFRICOM is the African Military Command that is coming out of the United States. They said that Russia and China, they're expanding their influence in Africa. Now, they've said this many, we know that U.S. officials say this pretty often. This was said amid the war. This was said on March 15th. So a couple days ago, this was said, right? So they said Chinese ambitions in Africa are long-term in range, from power plants and port investment to new military bases. But Russia, through its use of mercenaries, like the Wagner Group, is propping up autocratic regimes and strives for immediate influence across the continent from Libya to Central Africa, the Pentagon's top commander for the continent said Tuesday. So I'm trying to get you to see, like, this is a military commander amid the Russia-Ukraine war saying these things about Africa, saying you got China, they have this in Africa, and you have Russia, they have this in Africa, framing for the people like, oh crap, this is kind of bad for American interests, right? Army General Stephen Townsend testified, "It was troubling to me that half of the continent did not vote to condemn the Kremlin for its invasion of Ukraine in a March 2nd UN vote. Many African nations abstained from the vote, which Townsend described as biding their time. 141 nations condemned the Kremlin attack." Again, because African countries are being more silent. You know, they have more links to Russia. They don't have necessarily the reason to jump out there and support the West inside of their narrative of the Ukraine war. Because of this silence, they're going to penalize us, or at least they're trying to penalize us as far as public image for now. Townsend called Russian mercenaries a malign influence on African politics. They are buttressing dictators, he said. High-level access gives the Kremlin leverage to sway national economies. In addition, he said Russian oligarchs are using the continent to establish internet troll farms to influence policies and elections in Africa and other nations, including the United States. So here they are. They're dragging, not just dragging Africa through this, but they're saying things are happening in Africa that's going directly contrary to the interests of the United States. So I hope you all are seeing, they're kind of drumming up this image of Africa being Africa, or at least the countries that did not come out against Russia, being problematic to the U.S. interests. And those are the foundations that are laid for a country that's basically not just going to be demonized, but a country that in the future could be justified as requiring intervention. Think about it. Think about all the things that you heard before the wars in Iraq, the wars in Afghanistan. You heard about how this place is a cesspool for this group, and this group has control, and this group has economic interests, and this all leads to invasion of these countries. I hope you see that these are similar things that are being said to paint a picture of the U.S. of Africa, that could very much be used similarly. The Wagner Group and other mercenaries are present in Libya and in numbers. A nation engaged in a nasty civil war. Townsend said that they're especially noticeable in the Central African Republic. Remember, the Central African Republic, those people were protesting, supporting Putin. They took notice of that, okay? And they're widely accused of penetrating penetrating severe human rights violations and harassing peacekeepers, journalists, aid workers, and minorities. Wagner's presence puts the CAR government at odds with the United Nations and Western governments, which increasingly demand that the CAR ends dealing with the Russian company or risk losing their assistance. Here we go, Mali. We've talked about Mali a lot, right? Mali, we know, is another country getting help from Russia. They said the mercenaries are exerting a great influence in Mali, now governed by a military junta, collaborating with security forces in controlling the countryside. France cited the military takeover of Mali's government and the growing influence of the Wagner Group for pulling out of counterterrorism fight and possibly reducing its presence in neighboring Burkina Faso and Niger, all former colonies. The United States was providing logistical and intelligence support to the French in its Sahel counterterrorism efforts there, okay? So it goes on and on. They said in this part, deadly terrorism has been metastasized on the continent. He said the pull out back to Djibouti and Kenya caused new changes in intelligence gathering and raised risk to our troops. Townsend said that he's not seeking new, larger bases on the continent like the one in America, like the American one in Djibouti, but a presence in places like Somalia. We just talked about Somalia. Our presence is not dependent on permanent basis. He said a few troops and a bucks can go a long way. Now, listen to what they say about China. China, on the other hand, is working to develop more bases. This is something that I think we've discussed. I don't know if we've discussed on this channel, but I'm sure you've heard it, that China is trying to have more military bases. Townsend said Beijing is using its Belt and Road infrastructure initiatives and interest in minerals vital to high technology manufacturing and energy exploitation as entry points with African governments. They use those to build military cells and later expand to possible basing. So, do you understand like what this language is really pointing to as far as Africa's possibly being brought into a conflict in the future if there is some type of World War III between the US and China and Russia? They're literally painting this picture. And I think this is why I'm always reluctant, or I'm always uncomfortable when people just think, there's no consequences to these foreign relationships or foreign dependency, is that if the enemy of the West continuing to come into Africa, they're very long-term planners. I think that some of us thought that, they're not going to do anything, but there's long-term planning that's happening. I said this before with the different coups that are happening. A lot of people are like, yay, Mali has France out. They're relying on Russia instead. But you have to understand that those coups that are happening, they have consequences. Not to say that we don't, support pushing out the colonists, but we also have to think long-term, right? That these people are trying to find insidious ways to justify other types of intervention. And this is what's happening right here. You see the military. This is the Pentagon saying these things about the African continent, saying, number one, you should have voted with us, which is so crazy to me. You have to have our politics in international sphere. That's crazy, right? Like you're sovereign countries. That has nothing to do with the African continent. Yet you're telling me that this is what I have to agree with. I have to agree with you. And because they didn't agree, they're now analyzing your connections to China, your connections to Russia. And honestly, China has nothing to do with this conflict. That's the other funny thing. Because constantly, you're going to see that in the articles I'm showing you, China is being referenced. Why is China being referenced if China has literally taken no position on the Ukraine and Russia situation? My conspiracy mind says that they're trying to set a stage for something to happen also with China. I think that if you look at, again, how U.S. officials are talking to China, they're baiting the country basically to make a wrong move. Whether it's Taiwan or whether it's inside of the war with Ukraine. So the fact that this Pentagon official, he's not just talking about Russia and Africa, he's talking about China and Africa, that lets you know what they're saying. They're saying that all of this foreign presence that's not the US and not European inside of the African continent, these are enemy settlements, these are enemy relationships, and these things have to be weighed when we're talking about the defense of NATO. Pretty significant. Okay. So I want to show you another article. I'm just going to keep hitting this because I want you to see this is not just some, you might say, oh, African Esquire just going, down the conspiracy route. No, this is something that's consistently being spoken about. I mean, these are just some articles I'm pulling up, right? Russia's engagement with Africa pays off. Russia has been aggressively expanding its influence in Africa in recent years. They said, again, the UN vote. I'm not going to go into that again, but obviously they're upset. 28 out of 54 African countries sided with Ukraine. They actually list them out, the ones that abstained or did not side. They said Cameroon, Ethiopia, which we know right now is getting some support from Russia, military support, I believe. Guinea, I think, is also. Guinea-Bissau, Burkina Faso, we know is also. Togo, Eswatini, and Morocco were absent. Algeria, which has a history when it comes to these types of things. Uganda, Burundi, Central African Republic. Again, we know they're getting support from Russia military. Mali, Senegal, Equatorial Guinea, Congo, Brazil, Sudan, South Sudan. We know there's a war right now in Sudan. Madagascar, Mozambique, Angola, Namibia, Zimbabwe obviously has a horrible history of treatment from the West, and South Africa. and they see right now, Cyril Ramaphosa, he's the president of South Africa. He's probably been one of the ones that people were really like upset about, because again, you have to think South Africa in the minds of the West is still a white controlled country, even though they have Black politicians that are there representing the government. They still look at this as their country. So if you think about like how South Africa used to move with the West consistently, used to move with them. That was basically their country on the African continent. And to them, whenever they went from apartheid to post-apartheid, they're like, okay, we're not going to erase that legacy. Instead, we're going to support these puppet masters being put in place who are not going to threaten that historical dynamic between South Africa and the West. But South Africa, to its credit, even though there's a lot of problems there, even though there's a lot of compromises of the people's struggle, and the white landowners still control the vast majority of the land, while the Africans, who are the majority of the population, are being confounded to small townships where they really can't even have a property or anything like that. Despite the fact that that's obviously happening, South Africa has taken a number of stances that go contrary to the West. So obviously, they're not happy with Israel trying to join the African Union. They're outwardly supportive of the Palestinian struggle. And right here, Ramaphosa has been very much clear that he's standing with Russia. And this is something that I think really enrages probably more than any other country in the African continent. I mean, literally, if you look at like the stories about Africa with Ukraine, you're going to see Cyril Ramaphosa's face all over them. He's the one that they're most upset with, I think, because of South Africa. In their mind, this is supposed to be a white country. We let you run it somewhat, but we still were supposed to have control. Now, here's the interesting thing. They're saying that everyone's on the wrong side of history. If you don't take a position standing with Ukraine, you're on the wrong side of history. And of course, this is coming from people who have habitually been on the wrong side of history. Habitually. There's never been a moment since the creation of this country where the indigenous Native Americans were taken off their land, where they were on the right side of history. I'm talking about the United States. There's never been an instance where Europe went into Europe and claimed ownership of people who were sovereign and independent. They've always been on the wrong side of history, right? So it's very crazy to hear them say this, but this is what's being said. Now, they said this has generated fierce criticism, especially from intellectuals, diplomats, and opposition politicians in Africa. The refusal to condemn this war put Africa on the wrong side of history. This is what's being said inside of South Africa. Because, like I said, South Africa, for all intents and purposes, is still a white country in the eyes of the West. So they still have a stronghold there in that country. They said it's obvious that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is a violation of international principles of law. The president has since defended his government's decision to abstain from voting on the UN resolution. He said in a statement on Monday that the resolution failed to emphasize the role of peaceful dialogue in stopping war, which is why his country couldn't support it. Angolan political scientist Olivio Nkilumbu said that many in the ANC are still loyal to Russia. Some are of the opinion that the former liberation movement still owes Russia a lot since the days of the Cold War, and now we as Africans have to shut up about the Russian invasion. Now, there was a battle of words on Twitter. I thought this was actually very interesting. So basically, the Russian embassy in South Africa thanked South Africans who had expressed their solidarity with Russia's fight against Nazism in Ukraine, which is so crazy to me. Like, probably the craziest thing about all of this is that people are really like skipping over that whole Nazism component. And it's not to say every single person in Ukraine's a Nazi. That's not what we're saying. But it's a country where that is celebrated. That is just a fact. When you have armed forces all wearing Nazi emblems, that's celebrated. And that's something that is kind of being skirted over, which is like, I never thought I'd see the day because of how sensitive that is in Europe. It's a really amazing to me. Like, I like, it's kind of changed like a lot of what I think about how public opinion and how these politicians will sway people, because in a moment you have people who would never have supported this in the beginning. All of a suddenly, when it comes to Nazism, they completely flip, and it's like, oh, it's okay, or it's not that, it's not true, you know, and they're willing to overlook it, which it is true. There's a lot of people who are Nazi sympathizers in a lot of white supremacist groups that are living openly and happily in Ukraine, and so it's very crazy that dynamic is not supposed to seep into our subconscious as African people. The Nazis targeted us as who as African people. I want you all to understand that, yes, they mostly harmed the people, the Jewish people in Europe. Those are mostly the people who were killed. But it's not because the Nazis would not have killed Africans. They were basically doing their campaign in Europe. Whenever Africans were in Europe, or whenever Africans were basically are encountering Nazis, they too were a part of the Holocaust. There's a significant African population that were also victims of the Holocaust. And had the Nazis expanded into Africa, they would have continued the Holocaust. And I know all of you are probably saying, hey, you know, the big thing is that the Holocaust was a lot of the tactics were taken directly from the Namibian genocide. And that's something also that's Nazism. So it's crazy that we as African people aren't supposed to feel sensibilities about that. And yet, you know, this is what's happening. So it's very interesting. And I hope you all are like as fascinated with me as how public opinion or public sway is just like changing right now. Because it's very important for us to take note of these things, because I'm telling you, again, they're setting a stage for World War III. You're going to see another wave of public opinion changing, of minds being manipulated by this media system. I hope you all are not glued to mainstream media. I hope you know that these people are completely in cahoots with the state. I hope you know that they completely do not speak for the people. They speak for corporate political interests that go contrary to our interests. Because it's very interesting. You're going to see this more. I mean, I don't think this is happening, you know, now just to happen. I think this is truly going to manifest more and more into the future. So just had to take some time out to say how crazy it is. But yeah, so that tweet goes out from the Russian embassy, and Germany's not having it. So Germany's embassy in South Africa quickly responded with a tweet of its own. They said, sorry, we can't be silent on this one. It's just far too cynical. What Russia doing in Ukraine is slaughtering innocent children, women, and men for its own gain. Now, to date, I have not seen proof that, and I'm not saying, I don't know what's going on. Like, Russia could be doing some horrible things. I know they're doing things that are horrible, right? I've not seen proof of Russians going through villages, like slaughtering innocent women, children, and men. I've not seen that. But this is the narrative that the media is putting out there without evidence, right? They said, it's definitely not fighting Nazism. Shame on anyone who's falling for this. Sadly, we're kind of experts on Nazism. Germans are now the only ones who can say what's Nazism and what's not. But Germany's response provoked heavy criticism from South African Twitter users. Some pointed to the Soviet Union's support for South Africa's apartheid liberation, while others sided with Russia's justification for the invasion of Ukraine, or were critical of Germany's colonial history in Southern Africa. Thank you. Like, bring that up. Like, y'all still have not paid the Namibian people for a genocide. They put out a pay off, which was a concession, but still, when the people, the Herero and Nama people who have demanded compensation for what was done to their people, still nothing. Yet, who have you paid reparations to? The Jewish people who were hurt by the Holocaust. But any Africans that are being hurt, no reparations. So yes, you're not the one to tell us what's right or wrong, anyone from Germany. So yes, all right, I want to show you all one more article. I feel like I'm getting too fired out with this one. Let me make sure I'm done with this one. So again, okay, Russia resources and weapons. So they're saying just 1 year later, Africa has become Africa's biggest arms supplier. Now, I reported on this before too, and I just do want to emphasize this to people. I don't think this is true. I don't think that Russia is Africa's biggest arms supplier. I think that you significantly underestimate how much huger the American military industrial complex is. And not just that, how many things are done under the table where arms and weapons are traded to other countries as favors or to get support from those countries. I do not believe that Russia is the biggest seller of arms in Africa. I believe they are a seller of arms. I believe they have a significant presence in Africa. I do believe that. And I talked about that in a previous video, but I just want to be clear on that because I've seen some Pan-Africanist channels kind of, again, I mean, I'm not going to blame everyone because we get news, but we're not necessarily thinking that the news is coming from the same people who are who have an agenda behind it. So we get news about the Russian presence in Africa, right? If you compare it to the American presence in Africa, is it bigger? It's not bigger. But there is a Russian presence in Africa. I don't justify it. I'm not someone that justifies Russia and China. I don't justify it at all. I think that Africans need to have control over our own lands and all of those things. But let's just keep in mind that a lot of this could very well be propaganda. And I just feel like we have to have this attitude where people tell us things about Russia, China, or whoever, and we say, prove it. You know, if Russia's the biggest seller of arms in Africa, prove it. Don't just put out an article saying it. You have something that's going to prove that the United States is not the biggest seller of arms in Africa. I really would like to see that because I really don't think that's true. This vastly overshadows weapon supplies from other countries. They said China's 20%, France is 9.5%. And here's the kicker. They said the United States only sells 5.4% of weapons in the African continent. I do not believe that. That is absolutely not true. Again, the United States military industrial complex far huger. The presence in Africa far larger than any other country in the world. I'm supposed to believe that Russia's the biggest seller of arms in Africa with 30%, and that the United States is only selling 5.4%. I mean, it's just propaganda in my opinion. But this is what they're telling us. So again, you get what they're trying to do. It's about creating this anxiety, creating this nervousness. Oh my gosh, what is Russia doing in Africa? Oh my gosh, this could really hurt us. This can really affect us, right? What are we going to do to stop this growing influence? And you're going to see a lot of our parrots, and because we have a lot of people who parrot things in our community, getting on TV, and they're going to be saying these stats. They're going to say, well, the United States might have to because Russia has this huge influence in Africa. They're the ones that are selling most of the weapons. No, we have to use our common sense when it comes to these things. Like, come on now. I mean, I almost want to pull up a chart if I can Google it real quick. Just comparing U.S. military to other countries. Let me see if I can do that really quick. Okay, great. Let me show you this real quick. All right, so this is the United States military, right? $778 billion. And by the way, the budget just went up this year significantly. The United States spends more than any other country in the world. Compare this to Russia. Russia's around $450 billion for military versus the United States. Like, they don't want us to use our common sense. Common sense. You're telling me that this huge country, the larger exporter of weapons, you're trying to tell me that they're only putting 5.4% of the weapons in Africa there, despite the fact that we know that the Africa's military command in the continent, the huge presence that they have. Are you trying to tell me that I'm supposed to believe this? It's absolute nonsense. But unfortunately, if something's in print, many of our people just fall for it. So let's go to this last article. Didn't mean to take so long on that point, but I just want to hit one more article because, again, I'm trying to paint the actually this just what happened here. There we go. Okay. I'm like, tell me you didn't take this down before I got to read it on air. This just another reminder of what's happening as far as how we're being pitted against each other. I think that's the worst part about a World War III, whatever does happen, is that because of these different influences inside of Africa, whether it's the worst one, the US and Europe, or whether it's the ones that we're more sympathetic to, we should understand that we're going to see African countries, if something does happen, going to war with other African countries. And that's something that should honestly be thought about and loathed, because this, again, we're talking about unity. I mean, Pan-African unity or perish. That's the theme of the convention. That's what we're trying to promote as African people. This is something that really would have devastating effects on that realization, right? So Russia-Ukraine war creates blocks in Africa. While South Africa blames NATO, Kenya, along with the African Union, urges Russia to respect international law. Kenya, again, country I can't stand, but Kenya, not country, let me rephrase that. Leaders I can't stand. I love the Kenyan people. But when it comes to international, like, when it comes to the relationship with the United States, I cannot stand how Kenyatta basically bows to the West. I mean, on level with Kagame, so just correction there. While most African countries have decided to remain neutral in Russia-Ukraine war, experts say it has already created blocks in the continent, with many countries quietly siding with warring parties. President Cyril Ramaphosa was the first one to open a barrage against the West, blaming NATO for the war in Ukraine. He said he would resist calls to condemn Russia. And he said this, he said the war would have been avoided if NATO had heeded the warnings among its leaders and officials over the years that its eastward expansion would lead to greater, not less, instability in the region. Despite Ramaphosa's support for Russia, the AU earlier this month condemned Moscow's invasion and called for an immediate ceasefire. Senegalese President Macky Sall, who heads the AU and AU Commission Chairman Moussa Faki Mahamat, urged Russia to respect international law and sovereignty of Ukraine. Kenya's permanent representative to the UN, Martin Kamani, also denounced Russia. The action and announcement breach of territorial integrity in Ukraine. We do not deny that there has been many serious security concerns in this region, but that cannot justify recognition of these regions as independent states. So let's go forward. This is what I really wanted to focus on. They said the war is dividing Africa. This is what's being painted, and this is, I think, what can be very much true, actually. So this is a political scientist from Uganda's Kayambogo University. He said, although some countries are taking a position of neutrality, this conflict will eventually divide Africa into two blocks, one in favor and one other against Russia. Mustafa Mheti, a senior researcher of the Media Review Network, a Johannesburg-based think tank, said in the rest of the world, this war is testing the neutrality of various African countries in Africa. He said the war is creating blocks in the world, including Africa. The situation at this moment is reminiscent of the Cold War. They said the Russian and the Chinese have soft corners in Africa as they do not place unnecessary demands on countries when they give them a loan or anything that matters. Kakumba said that many countries in the continent purchased their military equipment from Russia and may not go along with the West directly to condemn Ukraine. Further, most of the countries in Africa have a history of being active with the non-aligned movement. If you don't know, non-aligned movement, we talk about it in the Declaration for AUMD, but founded in 1961 as a forum of 120 developing countries. And they basically were anti-colonial countries. They were countries that were formerly colonized that were taking a stance. And Russia also was a part of the non-aligned movement. This is what they're hypothesizing why Africa might be taking a stance. So to close this out, the last article the reason why I want to talk about that is because the way that they frame it, they're saying that Africa is in blocks. They're saying that Africa basically is divided. They're saying that the world is basically realigning based on their stances, whether they're pro-Russia, pro-China, or pro-West, pro-US. And this is something that is very much going to, again, lay a stage for something that could be very, very much against our own interests. If we understand that this is the exact thing that happened with World War I and II, if we understand that this is the thing that happened throughout the Cold War, is if we understand how proxy wars work, then we could really see, if we're not careful, African people, we could see a situation where you're going to see African countries going to war against African countries. And of course, it's not really us fighting each other. It's basically us being funded by Russia, or us being funded by the US, or us being funded by China, or us being funded by NATO. And that's going to cause internal strife. That's why I keep emphasizing with these types of conflicts, our focus must be on our own liberation. And unfortunately, we're put inside of this position where these leaders of these countries have already sold us out. And so the question is, what do we as African people do? Like when we're locked into this situation, we're already seeing the framing of Africa being divided. We're already seeing a framing of different spheres of influence. We're seeing that this, if a war does pop off, that's going to drag us directly into it. So what do we do as African people? We have to continue to enforce the idea that African unity must be our paramount focus. Not understanding our role in the African continent is based on colonial borders, but understanding our role is based on a commonality. The commonality is that regardless of what side you're on in this international conflict, we're all being colonized. We're all being suffering on the hands of these imperialist entities. And if something happens, guess what? We're all going to suffer. And we have to be very careful. As much as I can't stand a lot of the Kenyan government officials who bow to the West, principally the president, I in no way want, or as much as I can't stand a Kagame who, again, is very much in tune and connected to the West. As much as I can't stand these leaders, I would absolutely find it reprehensible if these people dragged us into internal conflicts. And the other thing is, we already are dragged into internal conflicts. That's probably the thing that hurts the worst. When you look at what's going on in Somalia, that's the United States war, yet Kenya's fighting it. Africans from Africans Africans from Kenya are the ones that are fighting in the United States war against Somalia. If you look at throughout the African continent, they're always using us to fight each other. How much more exacerbated will this become if the US and Russia go to war with each other, or US and China go to war with each other? So, not to scare anyone, but it's to say that we have to take this serious. We have to really focus, those of us who are based on the continent, focus on what needs to happen in order to protect ourselves from these types of leaders, to invalidate their decisions, to ensure that our sovereignty is first and foremost the thing that we focus on, and not focus on these international conflicts, because like I said, they're already setting the stage to drag us into wars that really should have nothing to do with us. So that's all I have for this. I hope you all are as alarmed as I am, but also just as watchful and as focused. We just have to stay focused and make sure that we're not following mainstream narratives, that we're always focused on what we know as a people, what we know is in our best interest, and what we think needs to happen to liberate ourselves. So that's it for today. I will see you all in